I call the meeting to order.
Vamos a empezar. Excelencia, señores y señores delegados, buenas tardes. Mucho nos alegra verles esta tarde. Me voy a presentar. Y yo soy el secretario de la reunión, secretario general de la organización. El 24 de abril, el presidente estaba sentado a mi lado al empezar la conferencia y dijo que se celebraría la presente conferencia de manera presencial. Pero los que no pudieran venir podrían hacerlo a distancia. Y ha sido posible. En cuanto a la interpretación, debo confirmar que afortunadamente contamos con interpretación el canal que deseen con el dispositivo que tienen ahí delante. Los que estén conectados a distancia verán un icono en la pantalla donde podrán elegir el idioma que quieran escuchar. En cuanto a la lista de oradores, no hay ninguna lista preparada de antemano. Cuando llegue el momento, si están ustedes en la sala, pues ya veremos. Si quieren hablar, tienen que pedir la palabra por el chat. Los que estén en línea o participen
At the same time, we request all those who are participating remotely to have their microphones off until such time that they are called upon to speak. We request all delegates then not to use the chat function for purposes of talking to about everyone in the room, but the chat function should be reserved then for only directing questions to the Secretariat or requesting the floor. Beyond that, we would request that we don't overutilize the chat function. For this afternoon, we have a session, 2 sessions to run for 3 hours. The first 2 hours of the session will be dedicated to the sub-working group on Article 6 and 7. And after that, we'll have the last hour of today dedicated to Article 9. To open the proceedings for today, I have the honor to invite the president of CSP8, Ambassador Thomas Gubel of Germany, to open this meeting. Over to you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Ladler. Good afternoon. Also from my side, I'm pleased to welcome all representatives of state parties, signatory states, other states, civil society and industry for this first day of ATT in-person meeting. As we've just heard, we have arranged an option for remote participation arranged for this week. However, let me say I'm very encouraged by the number of representatives physically present here today, and I'm happy that you all could make it to travel to Geneva. A warm welcome also to all those who will participate in this meeting remotely from different parts of the world. The series of meetings planned for this week provide another ideal opportunity for participants to further exchange views and share experiences on ATT universalization and implementation. And I would say it's even more ideal as we have now and this time this possibility to meet in presence and to have the necessary interactive communication in the room and also in the corridors. So you will recall that the 7th Conference of State Parties last year decided that an informal preparatory process should be established for the 8th Conference of States Parties, which is scheduled for 22 to 26 of August this year. The ATT meetings taking place this week, following the February meetings, form part of an informal process organized to provide ATT stakeholders with a platform to participate meaningfully in preparations for the forthcoming 8th Conference of State Parties. During the course of this week, the 3 standing ATT working groups established by the 3rd Conference of State Parties will continue with their respective work and present a continuous platform for exchange on various priority topics with a view to achieving outcomes that assist states in the practical implementation of the treaty at a national level. According to the schedule of the working groups meetings for this week, the working group of treaty implementation will start today. You will be reminded that this work is chaired by the Republic of Korea, by my colleague Ambassador Lim, which is assisted by 3 facilitators, Spain for Article 6 and 7, South Africa for Article 9, and Serbia for Article 11. Second in line will be the working group on treaty and universalization, which is co-chaired by Germany as the CSP8 presidency and Sierra Leone the CSP7 presidency. We will then conclude with the working group on transparency, co-chaired by the Netherlands and Panama. Documents for the meetings taking place this week were circulated by the ATT Secretariat to the ATT community and are currently also published on the ATT website in all languages of the treaty, that is the Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. To further facilitate exchanges in the ATT meetings for this week, I'm pleased to confirm that all working groups meetings, as well as the informal preparatory meeting on Friday, will enjoy live in-session interpretation. And the Secretariat has just explained how to make full use of this possibility. So as I conclude, I look forward to lively discussions during the working group meetings this week and to receiving the working groups progress reports at the CSP8 informal preparatory meeting on Friday. Thank you very much for your attention, and without further delay, I would now invite my colleague Ambassador Ignacio Sanchez from Spain, the facilitator of the working group, sub-working group on Article 6 and 7, to commence his work, and invite him here to the podium. So please, Ambassador, join us. Thank you very much.
Muy buenos días. Muchas gracias por su presencia, sobre todo todos los que se han desplazado a Ginebra para asistir presencialmente a las reuniones del grupo de trabajo. En nuestro caso, tenemos que retomar la tarea que dejamos en la sesión del mes de febrero. La pandemia ha condicionado nuestro trabajo.
We have continued the work done in February when we decided to have the sessions in hybrid mode, because it was impossible for everybody to come to Geneva, because there are still some restrictions in travel. We have had to limit the time for discussion. Point 5 and 6 of the agenda were scheduled to be discussed in February, but we could not finish them. So today we want to discuss Article 6, point 6 and 7, so that we can advance as much as possible, have the maximum progress, and try to close the debate so that we can restart the meetings with a normal schedule and recover lost time. In the multi-year work program, we had a lot of questions on our agenda. We're not going to redraft those questions. We're not going to find new legal expressions. In fact, we want to make it clear that the answers to the questions are already included in internationally agreed instruments recognized by a majority of states. And this is what make us find the way to include these new legal definitions in the future drafts. I'm looking for a pen, in fact. This is why I have been a little bit interrupting my speech. We have the possibility to make statements, general statements or specific, but we do not want to question the definitions already agreed. We just want to include in our guidelines the work of our next sessions. I don't know if it is necessary for me to repeat the questions. You have it in the work plan. I can do it in English, in fact, if you prefer, because this is what was agreed before. Point 6.
What does shall not authorize any transfer entail in the context of Article 6? What obligations and the measures adopted by the United Nations Security Council are covered under Article 6.1? What international obligations and the international agreements are relevant under Article 6.2? Para la sesión séptima,
for session number 7, the questions posed were
knowledge at the time of authorization under Article 6.3. How is genocide defined under international law? How are crimes against humanity defined under international law? What are grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions of 1949? What are attacks against civilian objects or civilians protected as such? What other war crimes may be included? Por lo tanto, lo que les invito es...
I am inviting you to treat these questions in an open manner. They mustn't be specifically one question after the other. We must just have some ideas, an exchange of ideas rather, so that they can be included in the voluntary training guideline. We have 2 hours to discuss the subject. I don't think it is necessary to have a coffee break. In fact, the coffee break will be at the end of the session dedicated to this working group and before the next working group meets. So the floor is open.
La delegación de
Switzerland has the floor.
Mr. Facilitator, thank you for giving us the floor. We gladly provide our interpretation on the mentioned concepts in Article 6. With respect to the first question, it is our understanding that any physical transfer of conventional arms across the border with an associated transfer of control is subject to the prohibition in Article 6, irrespective of whether it is a sale, a loan, a lease, or a gift. For example, if country A sends conventional weapons for a peacekeeping mission to country B and then hands the control over the conventional arms over to the country B, this should count as a transfer that falls under the ATT. With respect to the second question, it is Switzerland's understanding that these obligations concern all actions with respect to the threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression according to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Regarding the last question, we consider at least 7 international obligations as relevant under Article 6, paragraph 2. These are first, the UN Charter, second, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the CCW and its protocols, third, the Anti-Personal Landmines Convention, fourth, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, fifth, the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, sixth, the Firearms Protocol, seventh, the Convention Against Corruption. This list is not exhaustive. Under other international agreements with regard to international humanitarian law and human rights law may also be of relevant to Article 6 too. Regarding Article 7, the term knowledge, it is the understanding of Switzerland that the state party concerned shall not authorize the transfer if it has reliable information providing substantial grounds to believe that the arms or items would be used in the commission of the crimes listed. Regarding the term genocide, it is important to highlight that it is explicitly defined by the Genocide Convention and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The term crimes against humanity is defined in the Rome Statute and the customary international law. War crimes are serious violations of international law. They include the grave breaches as defined in the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and Additional Protocol 1 and in the Rome Statute. They also include other serious violations as defined in the Rome Statute and customary international law. We therefore do not see a need to define these concepts in the voluntary guide, but would prefer a reference to these existing sources of international law. We will provide this information in detail in writing to you, Mr. Facilitator. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And thank you for the long and very complete list that you have referred to. This is our purpose. We have to have a special mention of all the instruments that can be applied in the cases under considerations. They must be mentioned in the voluntary training guide. When discussing the international transfer of all forbidden conventional weapons. And I would be very thankful if Switzerland could send this list, and in fact all your statement by writing. All right, anybody else? The floor is open again. Ireland has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In light of the limited time for our discussion, I'll keep my comments brief and focus on Article 6.3, in particular the question surrounding what constitutes knowledge at the time of authorization. In our view, this requirement encompasses constructive as well as actual knowledge. Actual knowledge, to be required in every case, would set an exceedingly high bar. Rarely, if ever, can it be said with absolute certainty that arms would be used to commit atrocity crimes. In our view, the correct interpretation, in line with the object and purpose of the treaty, is that constructive knowledge is sufficient for the Article 6.3 prohibition on transfer to apply. This is in accordance with the ICRC's position that a state party must deny transfer under Article 6.3 if it has substantial grounds to believe, based on information in its possession or that is reasonably available to it, that the weapons would be used to commit genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. Lastly, Mr. Chair, I would like to just agree with what our colleague from Switzerland said, that we do not need to define concepts such as genocide or crimes against humanity in the voluntary guide, but instead refer to existing international law. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Irlanda, por la clarificación.
Thank you very much, Ireland. Let me make it clear that in our previous exercise, when we tried to clarify the definitions, 12 of the state parties, that is half of the state parties who took the floor, gave a very similar definition to the one that was just given by Ireland. This is a very common definition on knowledge. Knowledge means having enough information on what will be the fate of weapons that are moved across the border. So I think that we already have a very common approach to how we must include this idea, this concept in the voluntary guide. Excuse me, but I forgot my glasses, so I cannot see you. I don't know who's asking for the floor. The United States.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator, for giving me the floor. I just wanted to make a couple of brief comments. Regarding what you just said about knowledge and a majority of the states that you've heard from having this, so it's a commonly understood view, I just wanted to emphasize that it's important we keep in mind the negotiating record of the treaty itself in terms of the actual knowledge standard. And it is clear from the negotiating record that for the knowledge standard, that the minimum that you can require states to do is an actual knowledge standard, not a constructive knowledge standard. If states individual states wish to adopt a constructive knowledge standard on a national basis, they are certainly welcome to, but the minimum obligation that's actually in the treaty is an actual knowledge standard. Then also I wanted to make a general comment as we come up with lists of international agreements, relevant international agreements and the like, that we need to be mindful that not all states are state parties to all of these international instruments. And it might be useful to have some sort of caveating language which basically said that, potentially relevant international instruments could include the following or something, just to recognize, for example, like it was mentioned, the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention. Not all states parties to the ATT actually are parties to that treaty, and the same is true for some of the other ones out there. So again, it's useful to come up with an illustrative list for states to consider what might be relevant, but just be mindful that not everybody is actually a state party to all these treaties. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señor delegado.
Thank you very much. Of course, we must take into account that we're not given a recommendation for implementation, just some references that could be useful to state parties for according to their sovereign right to consult those instruments or any other instruments according to their national law. In the voluntary guideline, we give some general guidelines, but they are only orientations. They are not compulsory. This must be very clear. No state must feel compelled to apply an international covenant, international convention to which it is not party. This is very important. The State of Palestine has the floor now.
Mr. Facilitator, at the outset, the State of Palestine would like to thank you for your excellent work as facilitator of this group. We believe that this exercise encourages much-needed information sharing among ATT stakeholders and exemplifies one of the key purposes of the ATT, that is, to promote transparency. We reiterate that national interpretations must be compliant with ATT commitments and with well-established international legal standards. ATT provisions complement existing limits on arms transfer that stem in particular from the obligation to respect and ensure respect for IHL under Article 1 common to the 1949 Geneva Conventions, a key principle of the treaty. As weapons continue to flow to some of the most brutal armed conflicts, responsible arms transfer is a humanitarian imperative, and imposing restraints on such transfers is an essential element of any humanitarian response. Mr. Facilitator, in this spirit, we would like to make general comments first before answering the questions on the updated version of Chapter 1's draft of the elements of a voluntary guide to implementing Articles 6 and 7 of the ATT. First, under the contents section, we recommend including the general rules of interpretation under international law, as the third theme, right after the background and the treaty's text, as the purpose of this exercise is to provide clarity on how states parties approach the key concepts in Articles 6 and 7. We consider it critical to include here the general rule on the interpretation of treaties, as codified in Article 31 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which provides that a treaty has to be interpreted in a good faith, in line with the ordinary meanings of its terms, in their context, and in the light of its object and purpose. Second, with regard with the treaty's text, paragraph 4 of the guide, we recommend inserting the ATT's preamble and Article 1 into this theme, right before Articles 6 and 7. This is because the faithful interpretation and implementation of the ATT requires an understanding of the treaty's underlying aims and objectives. These are set out in the ATT's preamble and Article 1, which constitute the basis on which to interpret the treaty's obligations. Third, we recommend including references to the legal studies issued by neutral international bodies, in particular, the International Committee of the Red Cross Studies on the ATT. Mainly, I quote, understanding the ATT from a humanitarian perspective of 1916 and 1920, and the ICRC study on international humanitarian law and gender-based violence in the context of the Arms Trade Treaty, issued on 2019. Such studies are much needed as they contribute to the development of international humanitarian law and promote respect for it by governments and all arms bearers, and they will give state parties a fuller picture and better understanding of the legal background of these key concepts under international law. Fourth,
Четвертое. Рекомендуем делиться результатами тех стран-членов, которые приняли участие в упражнении. Необходимо обеспечить транспарентность таким образом, а также предоставить общую картину, которая продвинет обмен информацией между всеми странами-участницами.
with regard to paragraph 8, page 9 of the guideline, we believe that conclusion of the reference in this document is not intended to apply criminal law regarding individual criminal responsibility.
Что касается индивидуальной ответственности, мы считаем, что необходимо это предложение удалить.
And it will be counterproductive, prejudice the decision of states parties in this regard, given that it does not reflect a common understanding by all states parties. Sixth, moving on to paragraph 16, page 13, under the serious violation of international human rights law. We insist on the importance of referring to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the Apartheid Convention within the list of international instruments. They cannot be left behind. Seventh, with regard to paragraph 17 on the same page, we mentioned that the State of Palestine, its intervention, has mentioned before that the violations of IHRL cover a wide range of rights in accordance with their obligations under international law. States should refrain from transferring arms that affect the enjoyment of fundamental human rights protected under international treaty and customary law, especially Jus Cogens norms. The State of Palestine stresses that situations involving human rights violations should be assessed by the manner in which they were violated and their severity. We believe that the summary should either quote all examples of the Jus Cogens norms provided by the states, or otherwise keep speaking in general terms. The current listing is not adequate to address the obligations that are required by the law. Accordingly, the State of Palestine has provided a non-exhaustive list of violations that are serious, including but not limited to gross and systematic human rights violations. We reaffirm the importance of adding to the list at least the following: the apartheid, discrimination on racial, national, ethnic, linguistic, or religious grounds, violations of the right to self-determination, exemplified by illegal occupation, deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian objects in situations of armed conflict, indiscriminate attacks in situations of armed conflict, forced and large-scale population displacement, exemplified by illegal settlements, violation of the right to life, including murder and massacres and extrajudicial and summary executions, excessive use of force. And it's a long list. I will not take that much time in mentioning, but I keep mentioning blockades, discriminations, forced eviction, restriction on movement, attacks on human rights defenders and journalists, excessive use of force during peaceful demonstrations, direct targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, firing live bullets at peaceful demonstrations, etc. With regard to page 15, paragraph 25, the State of Palestine indeed supported the International Criminal Court's Office of the Prosecutor position on its policy paper on sexual and gender-based crimes, in which it identifies gender-based violence as violence against persons, whether male or female, because of their sex and or socially constructed gender roles. In this context, we also referred to the ICRC explanation of what forms gender-based violence, in particular its study entitled International Humanitarian Law and Gender-Based Violence in the Context of the ATT, in which it provides that gender-based violence is not always sexual in nature. It is broader than, but includes sexual violence. Unlawful killing is a serious violation of international humanitarian law and constitutes a serious act of gender-based violence. For example, in some conflicts, military-aged males are the victims of mass killings to prevent them from participating in hostilities. Therefore, we reiterate the importance of including this aspect, which should not be left out of the guideline. With regard to paragraph 34 and 35, page 17 of the guideline, could you please clarify if the wording generally means that most of the 20 states supported the actual knowledge theory? Here we must remind that if we take a look back to the historical background of the treaty, we will see that the other opinion supporting the constructive knowledge approach has been supported by the International Court of Justice and the International Committee of the Red Cross and several states, while the actual knowledge approach has been supported by fewer states. In any case, Article 6, paragraph 3 refers to knowledge that the weapons would be used to commit the listed crimes, indicating a lower burden of evidence to deny the transfer than knowledge that the weapons will be used for such ends. In other words, the level of knowledge required to prohibit a transfer under Article 6, paragraph 3 is not one of absolute certainty. And I can refer to the parallel that can be drawn with the user's guide to the EU Council Comment Position 2008, defining the common rules governing the control of exports of military technology and equipment, which notes that the language might be used in Article 2, Criterion 2 of the Common Position, requires a lower burden of evidence than a clear risk that the military technology or equipment will be used for internal repression. ATT states parties would need to take this interpretation into account in implementing Article 6, paragraph 3 in relation to all the listed crimes as a matter of advancing the humanitarian purpose of the treaty, including ensuring respect of IHL. Therefore, we recommend to delete the word generally to describe the first opinion, because it would give an impression that it's more reliable than the other opinion. Finally, there is a repetition of the list. I quote, "The list is indicative," both in paragraph 16, page 13, and in the citation below in the same page. Therefore, we think that this sentence is not needed in this page, as it has already been clarified in paragraph 2, page 9 of the guideline. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de Palestina por su intervención. Sin duda,
Thank you very much to the State of Palestine. The studies carried out by independent organizations are fundamental. You've cited the document from the ICRC, and I also wanted to bring your attention to the handbook, which was published a few years ago by Small Arms Survey as a handbook for the implementation of the treaty. This handbook covers all the different elements at hand to be able to respond to some of the questions you put forward. Once again, I'd like to state that this is a handbook to an indicative handbook. It's not an obligatory interpretation of the articles. Most of the state parties that responded to the survey we sent 2 years ago stated that in most of the cases, these are assessed case by case, that is, one by one. As the State of Palestine just highlighted, there are different levels of knowledge, different ways in which one garners that knowledge, and which need to be studied case by case in one operation or another. So each case that is submitted to our assessment to decide whether it has to be prohibited or not is specific. What we need are resources, enough resources in order to be able to carry out that assessment, both at a national level as well as at an international level, and in the handbooks or directives of the EU. The competent authority that needs to decide on the given operation needs to have enough resources to take a decision, and they will need to apply specific knowledge to that case. That's why we cannot speak about general knowledge, and this shall be put forward in the guides, because it was one of the conclusions drawn by the state parties that took part in the pertinent consultations. Competent authorities need to know what resources are available so that they can assess each case accordingly, in accordance with the documentation that's the object of the operation that's being analyzed. I see someone else wants to take the floor. Excuse me, I cannot see you. Could you please introduce yourself? ICRC.
Thank you very much. The International Committee of the Red Cross welcomes the work undertaken by the sub-working group on a potential voluntary guide on Article 6 and 7. And we'd also like to express our thanks to you, Ambassador Sanchez, for facilitating this work. Now, in line with our mandate and our mission to prevent suffering by promoting and strengthening humanitarian law and universal humanitarian principles, the ICRC has offered some comments on the draft elements, and we'd be grateful if these could be made publicly available on the ATT website. And we would also like to express our thanks to you, facilitator, for reflecting these comments in the revised version. I'll reserve our remarks on Article 6.3 for a later point. At this stage, I would simply like to say that in the view of the ICRC, a potential voluntary guide should provide practice-oriented guidance to states parties in their endeavor to establish the highest possible common international standards for regulating or improving the regulation of the international trade in conventional weapons, and facilitate progress towards realizing the ATT's humanitarian objective. And so to this end, it would seem to us that such a guide could ideally identify the sorts of questions that typically arise from the practical application of Articles 6 and 7. So the practical application on a case-by-case basis, as you've just said, Mr. Facilitator, to concrete arms transfer decisions. So it could include decontextualized case studies based on real-world experiences that illustrate the very real challenges that states parties are faced with in practice, and identify, ideally, concrete measures that states parties have developed over time or are thinking about, contemplating, trying out to address these challenges, which are likely shared challenges shared by other states parties. We'd also like to echo the point made earlier that such a guide could benefit from building on and further developing work that has already been carried out in the framework of the ATT, but also outside of it by diverse stakeholders. The guide could cross-reference these existing resources and or perhaps even take up some of the recommendations already articulated. And ideally, such a guide would be a living document from our perspective so that new insights can be added on an open-ended basis. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias al Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja.
Thank you very much to the ICRC, and thank you as well for your comments, which you sent in writing to improve the guide. This guide is something which we all need to contribute to. I think that I forgot to respond to the question on the possibility of publishing the comments of the state parties that took place in the workshop on transparency. Some state parties mentioned that they wanted to leave that information confidential. That's the case of Spain. The General Council, which allows or authorizes the transfer of weapons, are celebrated privately. So the decisions or the motivations behind the decisions taken in that council cannot be published. I think this is something we need to bear in mind when adopting decisions, because the national laws can impose restrictions, like the case of Spain, when it comes to publishing the motivations of the decisions taken. However, state parties can always publish national reports to illustrate how they are implementing their laws, or they can decide to publish the annual reports, which they then submit to the ATT. The EU has the floor. Thank you very much, facilitator. We'd like to thank you, Ambassador Sanchez Lerin, for your efforts, your continuous efforts on the work of the Article 6 and 7.
Most of all, of course, in terms of obligations to exporting states, parties, and the effective treaty implementation begins and ends with the serious risk assessment that are being conducted by exporting countries under these articles. We would encourage the states parties, therefore, to continue the work on your voluntary best practice guidance document with a view to finalize it as soon as possible. The document could indeed be a useful tool when assessing arms export license applications. And while these risk assessments under Article 7 remain a national prerogative to be carried out on a case-by-case basis, as also mentioned by you, Mr. Facilitator, the exchange of good practices amongst states parties can have an added value for all of us. Finally, we would also like to draw the attention of states parties to Article 6, paragraph 3. A state party shall not authorize any transfer of conventional arms if it has knowledge at the time of authorization that the arms or items would be used in the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, attacks directed against civilian objects or civilians protected as such, or other war crimes as defined by international agreements to which it is a party. When reading this article and facing the current situation of the war in Ukraine, the EU feels that exporting arms in the current context to Russia would not be permitted under the ATT. As a result of the Russian Federation's unprovoked, unjustified military aggression against Ukraine, and given the many grave breaches by Russia of the Geneva Conventions, including continuous deliberate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. Thank you, Mr. Facilitator.
Muchas gracias al delegado de la Unión Europea por su intervención.
Thank you very much, EU. MAT for Peace has the floor.
شكرا سيادة الميسر.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. Are you hearing me clearly? Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. The international community has been concentrating on small arms, although these conflicts usually have more complicated circumstances and might use modern warfare in the battlefield, especially in as we see many developing countries that are able to manufacture such weapons, and we can't just limit ourselves to the big manufacturing countries, and also the local use of these weapons, which leads to the possibility for combatants to obtain warfare from a number of sources. And these small and light weapons are the most used weapons in organized crime and the gang crimes. We can say that many of the security crises today that have exacerbated because of these small and light weapons, and for example, the continuous influx of ammunition is maybe the major source of war in South Sudan, and especially, and this is a continuous threat for children and their families. And according to the statistics of UNICEF during 2020, these remnants of weapons have been distributed to children and has led to using children in wars. And we've seen this in Somalia, in Congo, and in Central Africa. And therefore, we would like to seize this opportunity to thank you for preparing this voluntary guide, and we thank all those who have exerted great efforts in order to disseminate knowledge and information about the use of illegal weapons. And we would like to propose certain points to be put into this guide and not to target civilians or extrajudicially killing. And we believe that there is a necessity to put or set down a definition to collective crime, and we are strengthening and raising awareness and preparing this voluntary guide. Therefore, we believe this is an opportunity to present all the definitions that would allow state parties to use. We would also like to refer to that we have listened to all the interventions that have been made so far and presented to the Secretariat.
Thank you.
Tiene la palabra la delegación de Japón.
Japan has the floor.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Mr. Facilitator, Japan would like to begin by expressing its sincere appreciation to you, Ambassador Sanchez, facilitator of the sub-working group on Article 6 and 7, for your precious efforts as facilitator leading to substantive progress in the work of this sub-working group. Under the current international security circumstances, controlling arms transfers and ensuring the implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty has become even more critical. In this sense, Japan attaches great importance to the role of the Working Group on Effective Treaty Implementation as a forum to share national practices and to discuss tangible steps for further enhancement of the implementation of the ATT. Mr. Facilitator, Japan would also like to thank you for presenting the revised draft of the Voluntary Guide, Chapter 1. Japan welcomes the revised version, which duly reflects comments and suggestions made in the previous sessions by state parties, including by those by Japan, and clearly indicates that the nature of the lists are non-exhaustive and that others may also be relevant in several paragraphs. We also support the very concept of the current draft guide, which consists of a compilation of the views and inputs from state parties as a reference and does not include any definitions of each term. Bearing in mind that the purpose of this voluntary guide is to be used as a reference to assist state parties in implementing Article 6 and 7, and in particular, the export control authorities of each state, we need to continue to proceed with caution, not to create new norms and standards for the subsequent discussions on the following chapters. Lastly, as it is the first time I take the floor, allow me to congratulate the Philippines for their ratification of the ATT on 24th of March this year, and for becoming the 111th state party and the first ASEAN member state to join the treaty. Japan warmly welcomes the Philippines as a new state party from Asia-Pacific region and appreciates its efforts to complete the ratification process. To promote and strengthen the effectiveness of the ATT, further universalization is necessary. Japan hopes the voluntary guide on which we are now deliberating will contribute also to promoting universalization and enhancing the implementation of the ATT. Thank you for your kind attention, Mr. Facilitator.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Japan, for your intervention. Control for Arms, you have the floor.
Excellencies and distinguished colleagues, Control Arms thanks you, Mr. Facilitator, for your continued diligence in addressing these critical issues at the heart of the ATT. Of particular concern at this moment is the situation in Ukraine, specifically the way it relates to the effective implementation of both Articles 6 and 7. Troubling reports are emerging from Ukraine on a daily basis. A woman in a village west of Kyiv told Amnesty International that on 9 March, 2 Russian soldiers entered her house, killed her husband, then raped her at gunpoint, while her young son hid in a boiler room. The woman was able to escape from the village to Ukrainian-controlled territory with her son. This is just one example of the deliberate killings, gender-based violence, and widespread intimidation by Russian forces against unarmed civilians documented across the Kyiv region. Deeply disturbing is the discovery of mass graves and evidence pointing to summary executions of civilians by Russian forces in Bucha and other areas near Kyiv. Further, OHCHR indicated last week that Russian armed forces have indiscriminately shelled and bombed populated areas, killing civilians and wrecking hospitals, schools, and other civilian infrastructure, actions that may amount to war crimes. As the EU noted earlier, Control Arms believes a rigorous application of ATT Articles 6 and 7 should stop all transfers of arms or related equipment to Russia, whether under new or existing contracts, that could facilitate the commission of war crimes or other serious violations of international humanitarian law by Russian forces in Ukraine. While Control Arms recognizes Ukraine's legitimate right of self-defense, it is vital, even in these circumstances, that ATT states parties transferring arms to Ukraine apply the treaty's provisions in full, in particular, conducting due diligence in the application of Articles 6 and 7. To demonstrate the strength and utility of the ATT in this challenging time, we call on all ATT states parties to share with this forum the ways in which they are maintaining their ATT obligations when assessing whether to authorize arms transfers into the current conflict in Ukraine. With regard to the voluntary guide, Control Arms recognizes the efforts of this sub-working group to complete the first chapter, which reflects comments from various stakeholders on the latest draft. We can see progress in clarifying the purpose and character of the voluntary guide, including the recognition that the list of legal instruments is not exhaustive and reflects the views of specific states parties, rather than any common understanding among them. Clarity is also provided in terms of the aim of Chapter 1, which is not to reinterpret concepts that have established interpretations in international law. Some outstanding issues still require further attention. The voluntary guide should clearly indicate that the information collected in Chapter 1 consists of survey responses provided by anonymous stakeholders, none of which has been reviewed or analyzed for validity or accuracy. In the absence of such consideration, Control Arms is concerned that the voluntary guide could undermine existing international legal norms. For key concepts that do not have existing or accepted legal definitions, we are not persuaded that the responses so far are adequate to provide sufficient guidance. We suggest that the sub-working group consider other approaches that states parties could use to further explore and elaborate these concepts. With regard to the anonymity of responses, Control Arms notes that the names of survey respondents, be they states parties, civil society, or others, are not included in Chapter 1 of the voluntary guide. Control Arms seeks clarity on why the inputs of states parties to the voluntary guide are anonymous. Given that transparency is a key purpose of the ATT, we see value in attaching the content of each input with its source. In doing so, states seeking to gain a deeper understanding of these key concepts could benefit from the ability to engage individual respondents in further discussions. Also in this regard, we support ICRC's point to focus the guide on practical experiences, as these are useful to all states parties to establish the highest possible common standard for the international trade of conventional weapons. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Muchas gracias por su intervención y querría hacer una clarificación.
Thank you very much for your intervention. And let me make a point about these concepts that have not been legally defined. Through an exchange of best practices, we have tried to understand how states are applying these concepts. The purpose is to know whether there is more or less uniformity in the interpretation or understanding of these concepts. In our exchange of best practices, we have focused on the implementation of the treaty. But I think you have just said that there are other ways of going about. So how do you proceed? How do you propose to proceed? What other means, what other ways do you think exist to have a definition that are not legally defined, apart from the way that states themselves define it, interpret it, and apply them? I am at your disposal. I will be very much happy to receive your written or oral comments on the effective, actual implementation of the treaty. I repeat, in the exchange of best practices, we wanted to find out how state parties are applying the concepts that have no legal definition. Coalition for the Limitation of Arms Transfer has the floor.
Se supone que están conectados en red y que están pidiendo.
Sorry, are they online? Are they asking the floor?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. In the first phase, we would like to thank the working group and the Secretariat for the efforts that have been deployed to organize the preparatory meetings and in the Coalition for the Limitation of Weapons. As an alliance of civil society in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, we have all come together to reinforce the international conventions aimed at reducing the proliferation of weapons. Mr. Moderator, 2nd of April 2013, the UN General Assembly adopted a document on traditional weapons by establishing international standards of the highest level for the elimination of the illicit trade in conventional weapons. And this treaty is the first one where human rights and humanitarian concerns are fully integrated in global conventions on the control of the proliferation of weapons in the international trade of weapons, where certain regional or national laws have been excluded or did not take them into account. And these are the shortcomings which have enabled the weapons to come into the wrong hands and to be rerouted to the black market. The ATT contributes to equality of opportunity and to overcome the shortcomings that are used by arms dealers. And Articles 6, 9, and 11, as per which the transfer of conventional weapons should not be authorized, and there is no authorization for conventional weapons if the transfer would go against the measures taken by United Nations Security Council as per Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, and the obligations of non-exporting these weapons where there is a high risk of a negative effect. Other parties have also defined directives addressed to importing countries, requesting importers and exporters to cooperate in the exchange of information to evaluate the use of these weapons, and the obligations of the states where there are weapons that are traded trans-border, and transit measures when these high standards aimed at ensuring that weapons do not end up in the hands of those who could have infringements of humanitarian law. All the decision makers must apply these rules in a consistent and objective and non-discriminatory fashion. The huge suffering of humans means that it is absolutely necessary to apply the rules in international trade and to comply with the highest level of standards. Exporting countries have not complied with these obligations, selling weapons to countries in armed conflict. The prevention of transfer of weapons in armed conflict, small weapons and light weapons and small caliber weapons, which have given rise to all sorts of abuse. The limitation of these weapons means that the principles based on international law and principles should be the cornerstone of an international effort to apply the obligations imposed on states and in the trade of weapons, or particularly Articles 6, 7, 9, and 11, of having a full legal mechanism based on highest international standards to reduce a transaction. Secondly, states must agree of a follow-up mechanism which foresees a transparent and impartial approach of sanctions, appropriate sanctions against those who infringe these rules, of prevent irresponsible transfer of weapons, and of the non-use of these weapons. And fourthly, the importance of controlling trade in weapons in armed conflict zones to ensure the control of the transfer and transshipment of weapons, to ensure the appropriate embargo going against human rights, and this through the black market, which exacerbate international conflicts and civil strife. Thank you very much. Thank you for your intervention. I now like to give the floor to ASCR. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. We would like to congratulate you for the preparatory work and the Secretariat, which has made it possible to fulfill this. We endorse the proposals that have been submitted by Switzerland. We would like to specify that in the knowledge, the UN expert reports, the NGOs and civil society, and parliamentary reports. We share the statement by the European Union on the application of Article 6, sub 3, concerning the war in Ukraine, and the need of suspending export of weapons to Russia. However, we are surprised to see that the most committed states in Article 6, sub 2, weapons to Russia, are in fact the main exporters of weapons towards countries of the coalition involved in the coalition war in Yemen, US, Spain, France, the UK, and Italy. This coalition led by Saudi Arabia against the population of Yemen. This is a terrible signal which is sent to the peoples of the world and goes against the basis of our work here, which is to ensure non-discriminatory application of Articles 6 and 7 of the ATT. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much. The State of Palestine has the floor again.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. With this statement, we would like to provide our interpretation on the mentioned concepts provided under the scope of Article 6. With respect to the first question, we agree with Switzerland's answer, and we affirm that Article 6 applies to all forms of transfer referred to in Article 2, Paragraph 2 of the treaty: exports, imports, transit or transshipment, and brokering. With respect to the second question, we reiterate that under Article 25 of the UN Charter, and in accordance with the UN Charter, each UN member state is required to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council. Under Article 41, contained in Chapter 7 of the Charter, the Council may decide what measures not involving the use of armed force are to be employed to give effect to its decisions, and it may call upon the members of the UN to apply such measures. These may include complete or partial interruption of economic relations. An arms embargo is therefore a complete or partial interruption of economic relations with respect to the transfer of weapons. Since each UN member state is already required to respect a Security Council embargo, this provision reiterates an existing obligation. We restate that measures other than arms embargo adopted by the Security Council under Chapter 7 can be relevant here. In addition, these obligations concern all actions with respect to threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression, according to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. ATT states parties should act responsibly when dealing with states involved in the violation and disrespect of the Security Council resolutions. This is particularly important in case of prolonged conflicts and active conflicts, where arms trade will only serve to fuel conflicts and lead to further the conflicts instead of resolving them. Regarding the last question, the scope of relevant international obligations under international agreements to which it is party is potentially very broad. The term in particular signals that the provision covers more general international and regional instruments in addition to those that directly address the transfer of or illicit trafficking in conventional arms. Therefore, we reiterate that Article 6, Paragraph 2 incorporate human rights treaties to which a state party to the ATT is a party. Such reading is consistent with the principles 5 and 6 of the preamble section of the ATT. We consider at least the following international obligations as relevant under Article 6, Paragraph 2. These are the UN Charter, Geneva Conventions, regional and international human rights treaties, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons and its protocols, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crimes. In addition, states must take into account the prohibitions under customary international law and the jus cogens and erga omnes rules, which continue to apply independently of the ATT. Thank you, Mr. President.
Muchas gracias por las nuevas aportaciones de la delegación del Estado de Palestina.
Thank you very much for this new intervention to the state of Palestine. France has the floor now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and allow me to thank you for the documents which you sent prior to this meeting, as well as for the presentation of your proposals following the work that was exchange of views on the implementation of fundamental concepts in Article 6 and 7 of the ATT. As you know, France contributed to this work by recalling its national practice based on an evaluation on a case-by-case basis, a source of various information, taking into account a number of factors in context and circumstances in which you have this foreseen export, the final destination, and the final user, and the final usage, and also the type and volume of equipment concerned. The position of France is well known, Mr. Moderator. I will just succinctly recall it. We feel this guide aims at having a panorama of national practices and identifying national concepts without trying to impose any single interpretation in the light of the spirit of the treaty. France is prepared to contribute to the work being carried out in this subgroup, which is aimed at an exchange of information between state parties on the way in which they implement Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty. And Mr. Moderator, we'd like to thank you for the very significant efforts that you've undertaken in this respect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, France, for your support in our work. Ghana has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator, and let me congratulate you for the good work you have done so far and the excellent nature in which your draft document seems to be emerging. Let me also thank the Secretariat for the hard work they put in this, and especially making these meetings possible after the long break as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And also congratulate China and Philippines for joining the treaties. I'd like to say thank you for coming on board. Mr. Facilitator, whilst it's important that the guide would be a voluntary one, there is no gainsaying that it may become the basis for implementation for some states, and for that matter, a basis for decision whether to approve or reject a particular transfer request. Reading through the draft document for the voluntary guide for implementing Articles 6 and 7 of the ATT, it is clear that states that responded to the survey made references to international laws and other treaties and instruments that they are parties to. It is also obvious that not all state parties of the ATT are parties to some of the treaties and instruments under reference in the draft guide. It is pretty clear that sometimes states refuse or do not want to be part of a particular treaty or instrument because of one or two clauses or articles that they disagree with or do not find comfortable, and not the entirety of the particular treaty or instrument. Consequently, we would like to suggest that instead of wholesale reference to the existing treaties or instruments, states should consider specific definitions of concepts in those treaties and instruments, and then those definitions and concepts are probably brought for consideration and adoption into the guide. I thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de Ghana.
Thank you very much, Ghana. Thank you very much also for the very kind words that were directed to me, as other delegations have also done before. So thank you very much. I must say that fundamentally it is the Secretariat who has carried out most of the work. I would be unable to present all the documents that I have submitted to you without the help of the Secretariat. They know their subject very well, all the details, and much more than myself, because I not only work on this treaty, but I work on many other subjects, so it is difficult for me to know all the details that the Secretariat knows. To answer Ghana, you said that we must take into consideration the fact that some of the state parties are not necessarily parties to other international conventions mentioned in the draft guide. Very well. Let me make clear that we have a list of documents or international treaties, international conventions that can be taken into account when implementing the treaty. They are only a reference, a practical reference that states can consult and take into account totally or just in part in the exercise of the full sovereignty, so they can take into account some of the instruments in the list to approve or refuse some of the export operations. Mexico has the floor now.
Sí, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes, sir. First of all, I would like to thank you for your leadership, and thanks as well. I want to thank as well the Secretariat. Thank you very much for finding this hybrid solution that make it possible for many states to take part in our deliberations. Mexico considers it very positive that the CSP8 will go deep in the analysis of the implementation of the treaty. Mexico wants to stress how important international cooperation is in order to achieve a full implementation of the treaty. Thank you very much to you, Ambassador Sanchez de Lerin, for the list that you have provided, for the elements that can be used as a reference in order to implement the treaty. And more specifically, Articles 6 and 7. Apart from the fact of the things that are mentioned, such as the violation of humanitarian law, international humanitarian law, and human rights, we must take into account the access to international crime, to arms and munitions, through international trade or a relaxation of controls. When we discuss universality of the treaty, we are going to say this again, but now I want to thank Philippines and congratulate Philippines for joining the treaty. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mexico, for your statement. And now the Philippines have the floor. It's the first time that they take the floor in the framework of this treaty, so they're very much welcome.
Mr. Facilitator, we first wish to thank you for your excellent work as facilitator of this group. And with this statement, we would like to note some of the Philippines' ongoing efforts in the implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty. Thank you for the other states who welcomed us to this treaty. On March 24 of this year, the Philippines ratified the treaty, and it will come into force for us on June 22 of this year. Our preparations for its implementation started in November of 2015 when our legislature approved the Strategic Trade Management Act, which forms the basis of the Philippines National Control System. It is supported by the Comprehensive Firearms Act and the Customs Management and Tariff Act. The ATT assessment criteria under Article 6 and 7.1 is already embedded in our domestic law and its implementing rules and regulations. As a result, if there is a substantial risk of any of the negative consequences listed in Article 7.1 and Article 7.4, the Strategic Trade Management Office or the Philippine National Police Firearms and Explosives Office, which are both responsible for the issuance of export and import permits for conventional weapons, are required to deny the permit application. We view our recent ratification of the ATT as an opportunity to further enhance our trade controls and therefore choose to apply the ATT criteria not only to proposed exports, imports, brokering, transit, or transshipment of ATT items, but also to all dual-use items. Further, we welcome the collaborative approach in the development of the voluntary guide to implementing Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty, which will help the Philippines in its implementation as well. Mr. Facilitator, with this information, we would like to assure you and the Presidency of our full support throughout this meeting and in your efforts leading up to the 8th Conference of the States Parties. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Filipinas, por su...
Thank you very much to the Philippines, and I congratulate you for your ratification. We have 3 delegations now on the list, and then the ICRC will make a brief presentation on the term of knowledge. If other delegations want to take the floor, they can do it later. But we have to finish the meeting on time. Georgia has the floor.
First of all, I would like to thank the ATT Secretariat for giving me an opportunity to attend this preparatory meeting.
I also want to thank you, Mr. Facilitator, for giving me the floor. The main aim of my state in a decision-making process is not to authorize any transfer of conventional arms if it has knowledge that the arms would be used in the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, attacks directed against civilian objects or civilians protected as such, or other war crimes as defined by international agreements to which Georgia is a party, also takes into account relevant factors including information provided by the importing state in accordance with Article 8.1, assess the potential that the conventional arms or items would contribute to or undermine peace and security, could be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law, commit or facilitate a serious violation of international human rights law, commit or facilitate an act constituting an offense under international conventions or protocols relating to terrorism and transnational organized crime to which Georgia is a party. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Georgia, por su aportación. Tiene la palabra la delegación de la República de Corea.
The Republic of Korea has the floor.
Thank you for giving me the floor, Ambassador. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Ambassador Goebel and the ATT Secretariat for their devotion to organizing this meeting. The Republic of Korea appreciates the facilitators' continuous efforts to faithfully reflect the opinions of the states parties and civil society presented during the last meeting with regard to the draft elements of the voluntary guide to implementing Articles 6 and 7. We believe that this guide will be another helpful reference for interested states parties when conducting risk assessment prior to authorizing export and interpreting Articles 6 and 7. With regard to the obligations in Article 6, the Republic of Korea has established a system ensuring its compliance by incorporating the obligations under measures adopted by the United Nations Security Council, in particular arms embargoes, into its domestic laws and regulations. The laws and regulations governing the national export control system, such as the Foreign Trade Act, include the control lists and obligations under the multilateral control regimes and international agreements to which the Republic of Korea is a party. Therefore, the licensing authorities assess whether an export violates any of those obligations in accordance with the relevant laws and regulations before making a decision on an export authorization, and do not authorize the export if it is deemed that the export would violate any obligation. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de la
Thank you very much to the Republic of Korea. Argentina has the floor now. Thank you very much, Facilitator. Given that this is the first time we take the floor, we'd like to thank you for the leadership you are showing and for the work you are carrying out in this sub-working group. You can count on our commitment. We'd also like to congratulate Ambassador Goebel, the chair of the 8th CSP, and the Secretariat for organizing these preparatory meetings. We'd also like to thank the Secretariat and the coordinators of the sponsorship program, because they have given us the opportunity they have given me the opportunity to be here in person and to contribute to the objectives of the ATT. Facilitator, my delegation supports the revised list of elements with key ideas for Chapter 1 of the voluntary guide, which constitute useful indicators to interpret the treaty. We'd like to echo the statements of other state parties, in the sense that when identifying the international law applicable, we need to clarify that that law is only applicable to the states that are bound by similar national laws. No state member is bound by any international agreement they have not adhered to. We also share what has been stated by other state parties in the sense that we should include in our legislation standards compatible with international human rights law. I'd like to make a general statement now on Article 7.4, referring to gender-based violence. Some of the challenges in this article have to do with the indicators and mechanisms that states have when assessing the effects of GBV. Argentina will submit a proposal, which my colleague from the National Agency of Controlled Material, ANMAT, who is following remotely, will make in a few minutes. Before that, I'd like to ask the Secretariat if they can open her microphone so that she can explain our proposal via Zoom. Good morning. Thank you to my colleagues for giving me the floor, and I'd also like to thank the Secretariat for giving us the opportunity to participate in this meeting, which is especially interesting for us. I'd like to highlight the existing link between the use of fire weapons and gender-based violence. We need to have this link clear to design preventive measures to reduce gender-based violence committed against women. Together with the initiatives carried out, we suggest elaborating a survey which would be sent out to state members to compile experiences in order to enrich our debate. The information collected, we believe, could be useful to continue working on this matter. It could also be useful for the risk assessment exercises, and states could use the results in carrying out their own risk assessments. We are willing to share our information with other delegations interested in this project, which we are already working on in Argentina. Thank you very much. Thank you, Argentina. I'd like to give over the floor now to the ICRC for their presentation on knowledge and related terms. And then China, Panama, and Control Arms will be taking the floor. The delegate from the ICRC will be presenting from the podium.
Adelante. Thank you, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, thank you for inviting the International Committee of the Red Cross to offer some remarks in the context of the sub-working group's exploration of Article 6.3, with focus on how knowledge and other relevant terms are interpreted in international law. Article 6 and 7, as we often like to say, are at the heart of the ATT. The faithful implementation of these provisions is paramount to realizing the ATT's humanitarian purpose. And one of the ATT's key aims reflected in Article 6.3 is to contribute to the prevention of serious international crimes by withholding the supply of weapons that would be used for their commission. Throughout the drafting history of the ATT, different formulations were proposed to articulate what absolute limits on arms transfers flow from states' pre-existing obligations under international law, including from peremptory norms, jus cogens norms of customary international law, and to develop these further. And the formulation ultimately retained is as follows. Next slide, please. That you're very familiar with. So, generally speaking, Article 6.3 contains few aspects that are, legally speaking, ambiguous. The main question, as we are all well aware here, is regards the interpretation of the level of knowledge that is required for a state party to prohibit the authorization of a transfer. And then, of course, questions remain about the practical application of the provision. Next slide, please. So to explore these questions, though in somewhat abridged form, given the limited time available, I'd like to just survey selected aspects of the international crimes that are listed in the provision. What acts constitute genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes tells us something about the sort of information that is relevant to states parties to know about. I'd also like to review or briefly touch upon states' due diligence obligations under international law to prevent these crimes, and then in light of this, look at the standard of knowledge and evidence that is appropriate, in our view, to Article 6.3. Next slide, please. Oh, yes, thanks. Yes, next slide, please. So as I said, the aim of Article 6.3 is to prevent the commission of some of the most serious international crimes, including the crime of genocide. And genocide has long been recognized as amounting to an international crime. It is formally prohibited in the 1948 Genocide Convention, and the Article 2 of that convention provides us indicated on the slide. To be aware of, for those less familiar with this area of law, genocide refers to acts committed with a specific intent to destroy certain types of groups, national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups. And acts of genocide can take diverse forms. So for the application of Article 6.3, however, it is immaterial whether an ATT state party is a party to the Genocide Convention, since genocide is prohibited under customary international law. Also worth noting that genocide can be committed in relation to an armed conflict or unrelated to an armed conflict. And so regarding what states parties should know in terms of the application of Article 6.3 is, on the one hand, they should have knowledge about how the arms recipient is likely to behave, and they should have knowledge about how the arms in question are likely to be used. In respect of the latter, and looking at the list of acts of genocide, we can already see that some of the acts do not require the discharging of a weapon. So, for instance, small arms could be used to threaten parents and children in the commission of the act of genocide or forcible transfer of children. With regard to the issue of the knowledge about how the recipient is going to behave, states parties to the ATT must refrain from transferring arms that would be used in the commission of genocide irrespective of whether perpetrated by a state or an individual, whether working for a state or in a private capacity. So there are some legal nuances there that are fairly complicated. I'll skip over these. In practice, states parties therefore must examine the policies of the arms recipients' authorities, as well as their pattern of behavior, from which, in some circumstances, a genocidal policy may be inferred, and they must also examine whether individuals, whether there is a real risk that an individual has the intention to carry out genocide. If any of these is present, they must not authorize the transfer. Next slide, please. As with genocide, crimes against humanity can be committed in times of peace or relative peace and in situations of armed conflict, but there is no global convention on this crime. So the International Law Commission has prepared draft articles on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity in 2019. Article 2 offers a definition, which is reproduced on the slide. In essence, it reproduces the text of Article 7 of the Statute of the International Criminal Court and is without prejudice to broader definitions found in customary international law or domestic law. As regards states parties, ATT states parties, what they must ascertain or what is relevant to them in the application of Article 6.3. We can note that here the acts have to be committed against any civilian population, not only limit the groups thereof, irrespective of whether they are nationals or foreigners. But there is no requirement of a specific intent as for genocide, but there's a requirement of widespread or systematic attack. I'll skip over the nuances here. In essence, this excludes isolated, spontaneous, or unconnected acts of violence. And there is a link required to a state or organization. And so for states parties, what is particularly of interest here in the application of Article 6.3 is whether there's a multiplicity of victims, perhaps even in different locations, whether there is evidence of a pattern or methodical plan or acts in furtherance of a common policy, a recurrent modus operandi. Evidence of a policy can be expressed in statements of an arms recipient, but they can also be inferred from action or from inaction. For example, if a government fails to prosecute or discipline abuses, that may indicate that the actions were organized rather than impulsive. Next slide, please. Now, I'll deal with war crimes relatively briefly, since we've recently explored this subject in the connection of Article 7. Grave breaches of the 4 Geneva Conventions are listed in Articles 50, 51, 130, and 147 of the Geneva Conventions, the first, second, and third, and fourth, respectively. Reproduced here is the text of Article 130 of the third Geneva Convention for the, relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. So in this connection, what is relevant to know for states parties, notably, is whether the victim is a person protected under one of those conventions or property protected under any of the conventions. Grave breaches are war crimes. They can only be committed in international armed conflict or situations of occupation. So another question that states parties must know about is whether there is a situation, legally speaking, of international armed conflict and whether the recipient is a party thereto. And in this respect, I would invite you to consult the ICRC's commentary to the Geneva Conventions, the latest one from 2020. Article 6.3 also refers to attacks against civilians, civilian objects and civilians protected as such. This is these are war crimes in international and non-international armed conflicts. And here, perhaps just offer the ICRC's view is that depending on circumstances, indiscriminate attacks and disproportionate attacks could qualify as attacks directed against civilian objects or civilians protected as such. And then other war crimes, here what we see is that the scope depends on what the transferring state party, what treaties it is a party to. And the ICRC, with a view to humanitarian purpose of the ATT, to effectively prevent all kinds of war crimes that are typically committed with weapons, the ICRC recommends that states parties apply Article 6.3 to a wide range of war crimes in both international and non-international armed conflicts. And indeed, a number of states parties have declared that they do so. In this regard, too, I invite you to consult the ICRC's discussion of war crimes under customary international law in our study, referring to the Rule 156. Next slide, please. In the implementation of Article 6.3, arms transferring states should bear in mind their obligations under international law, irrespective or sort of aside from the ATT, and several states parties today have already mentioned that. Particular relevance, their due diligence obligations to prevent genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Now, this is a complicated and fascinating subject. I'll only highlight two aspects here. Next slide, please. In respect of states' due diligence obligation to prevent genocide, it's interesting to look at the International Court of Justice's judgment in 2007 concerning the application of the convention, the Genocide Convention, where the court noted that a state may be found to have violated its obligation to prevent, even though it had no certainty at the time when it should have acted but failed to do so, that genocide was about to be committed. It is enough that the state was aware, or should normally have been aware, of the serious danger. The ICJ further explained that the obligation is a duty to act, irrespective of whether that action will or is even likely to succeed. And that means that states that manifestly fail to make their best efforts, which are within their power, would fall short of that standard. And then similarly, as states parties have already mentioned also today in the discussion, there is an obligation under international humanitarian law to respect and ensure respect for IHL in all circumstances, including in arms transfer decisions. And this obligation includes, in the view of the ICRC, a due diligence obligation to do everything reasonably in a state's power to prevent violations of IHL when there is a foreseeable risk that they will be committed. Next slide, please. So with these considerations in mind, let's turn to the question of knowledge in Article 6.3. What standard of knowledge should apply? Next slide, please. A restrictive interpretation is that there needs to be actual knowledge of the future commission of international crimes, so that a state party's compliance with Article 6.3 would be measured at what it subjectively knew. Another interpretation is that there only needs to be constructive knowledge that the arms would be used to commit the listed crimes. State parties' compliance would be measured at what the state objectively, based on credible, available information, should have known. Now, there may be little practical difference to the extent that actual knowledge may be inferred from the circumstances. The ICRC recommends that the term knowledge be interpreted objectively to include what a state party can normally be expected to know based on information in its possession or reasonably available to it. And this position is also reflected in the revised elements of a voluntary guide. And the ICRC would support the view expressed in that, in these elements, that this implies an obligation to actively seek out certain types of information that would normally be available. And so in regard of the information sources, then perhaps just interesting to note that the emphasis should be on intelligence and information about the likely future behavior of the recipient, and evidence beyond reasonable doubt of past crimes is not required. In this regard, the information sources included in sections C, D, and G of the list of possible reference documents to be considered by states in conducting risk assessments under Article 7 would seem to be particularly useful. Now, because the application of Article 6.3 calls for a prospective assessment of future events that are to be averted, it entails an evaluation of risk. But this evaluation must not be conflated with the export risk assessment mandated by Article 7. The risk of an international crime being committed with the transferred arms cannot be mitigated by measures envisaged in Article 7.2. So Article 6 establishes absolute prohibitions to transfer. But of course, the key practical question is, at what point should a transfer be denied? And scholarship and states have offered different applicable standards. Question, for instance, clear probability, a reasonable chance, a serious possibility, foreseeable, real risk, and so on. Now, in the view of the ICRC, a state party must deny a transfer under Article 6.3 if it has substantial grounds to believe, based on information in its possession or that is reasonably available to it, that the weapons or items would be used to commit one of the listed crimes. So substantial grounds requires more than a mere possibility, but a standard such as highly likely would, in our view, be too demanding, and certainty about future commission of a crime is not required. Article 6.3 contains the word would and not will. So perhaps just a brief point on the reference to the time of authorization in Article 6.3, read in conjunction with the obligations on general implementation under Article 5.2 and 5.5. A national control system must allow for the evaluation of this risk, the risk of serious crimes being committed with any of the weapons proposed for transfer and that will emanate from the state's jurisdiction. So the state needs to have the legal basis and the procedures in place that enable it to grant or deny such transfers. And it is our view that, against the backdrop of the ATT's purpose and also states' due diligence obligations under international law, that at the time of refers to the moment when the state becomes or should normally become aware of that risk. And this would imply a duty that does not end with the issuing of an export or import license or a transit authorization. So to sum up, next slide please, Article 6.3 establishes an absolute prohibition that allows for no exceptions. It should be interpreted in light of states' due diligence obligations under international law to prevent some of the most serious international crimes. What is expected of a state, the diligence that is due, depends on the circumstances, and states have some discretion and flexibility in terms of what measures they adopt, but these measures must be effective, they must be kept under review, and if found deficient, they must be strengthened. In practice, much will depend on the national control system of all states involved in a transfer. And since the application in practice of Article 6.3 can at times be challenging, The ICRC believes that consultations among states, exchange of information, and exchange of information on the practical application would strengthen prevention-oriented implementation of Article 6.3. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Muchas gracias a la delegada de la Cruz Roja por su
Thank you very much to the representative of ICRC, she has answered many of the questions we were asking ourselves. I still have 3 delegations on the list of speakers. Please be very brief because we are over time already and waiting for the next working group is waiting. China has the floor.
This is the first time that I speak in this work group. First, I would like to thank the ambassador and the secretariat for the tremendous work you have done for the meeting. And we also like the colleague from ICRC for their demonstration. Here, I'm very happy to see that a lot of colleagues have conducted very practical and sufficient discussion on the issues of this work committee. We believe that this kind of discussion will facilitate further understanding of ATT and will help effective implementation of ATT articles. And we will further engage in the discussion. Here I would like to make 2 general statements. First, with regard to the discussion on the legal obligations of the treaty, we are of the view that we should avoid reinterpretation of the key legal concepts and prevent any obligations beyond the scope of ATT to maintain the effectiveness and authority of the treaty. Second, China supports the national implementation practices of ATT articles. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a China por su intervención. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Panamá.
Muchas gracias, señor facilitador. En primer lugar, permítame agradecerle por
Thank you. First of all, I want to congratulate you for chairing this meeting, and thank you very much to the Secretariat as well and to the ICRC for their presentation. I'll try to be brief. First of all, let me point out that together with Switzerland and Ireland, we also have some reservations in redefining concepts such as genocide and crimes against humanity. We fully support the comment that Mexico made on focusing on the use made by organized crime of weapons and munitions. We are very happy with what they have said. Now, observing the document that you have presented on voluntary guidelines, we consider that in paragraph 16, we should include the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Third, as proposed by the State of Palestine, there has been an increase of hate crimes for ethnic and racial motives. And the violence of these crimes is increasing around the world. I think we should also include a mention of the Convention against involuntary on forced disappearances. The exploitation of prostitution is another important subject that should be included. the Palermo Protocol on the prevention, repression, and sanctions against forced prostitution should also be included. In paragraph 26, violence against women, it would be important to include the declaration and the platform of action of Beijing. And in paragraph 28, violence against children, we take note that there is a reference to the Convention of the Rights of the Child and rights of the child in armed conflicts, but I think we should also include the protocol of the use of children in pornography, in sex trade. Sometimes victims are forced to carry out these activities because they are threatened with weapons. We hope to contribute a little bit later on other points. Thank you. Thank you very much, Panama. Delegation of Control Arms, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator. I would just like to provide a brief response to the question you raised concerning how to further elaborate in the undefined terms and concepts set out in Chapter 1 of the Voluntary Guide. One possibility would be to convene small group meetings of ATT stakeholders that could then make recommendations or share ideas with the sub-working group. We're happy to explore this and other ideas on this topic in more detail, subsequently or in writing. Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator.
Muchas gracias a la organización Control Arms por su
Thank you very much for your constant support to our work. And now we can wrap up this meeting. I think it has been a very exhaustive work on the items that were included in our terms of reference. We are now preparing a draft voluntary guideline that would help countries to implement the treaty. But of course, we must take into account that states cannot be obliged, cannot be forced to apply conventions to which they have not presented their that they have not ratified. I think this must be very clear because the obligations of state parties must be very clear. NGOs and academic studies have brought their contributions, and we thank them very much. Thank you very much to the ICRC. Thank you for their ideas. They're always very clear and very objective and very well documented. A great help to drafting our guide. And sorry, Rob Wensley, I have, I think, stolen 8 minutes of your time. But I hope you can understand that it was important for us to finish our work. The meeting is adjourned.
Okay, let me just, if I can call the meeting to order. We are now making a transition to the second part of this afternoon. It's article number 9.
Esta tarde vamos a tratar el artículo número 9, tránsito y transbordo.
I hand over to you, Rob. Thank you.
Thank you, Dumisani, and good afternoon, colleagues. We're a little bit behind, but let's see if we can make some progress. What I'm going to do is to give an overview of what we've done thus far in terms of the multi-year work plan, what we're going to do today and tomorrow, and then one topic for future work that we need to look at. So I'm going to give that overview, then give the floor to Dr. Hernig, which or whom you would know from our last session, those of you who were here, to do a presentation, and then we are going to have an interactive discussion. Could you bring up the slides for me, please, Secretary? No, the other one. That's it. All right. So in case you were wondering what we're doing here, we're the sub-working group on Article 9, transit or transshipment. So in essence, the subgroup was established in December 2019, and the topics in the work plan were adopted in March 2021. So the emphasis is on sharing national practice on what we did. So there are a couple of topics that we focused on. The first, in our first analysis of this issue, was a discussion on national approaches to the terms transit and transshipment. And we looked particularly at trying to unpack those terms in terms of our national control systems. Topic 2, we looked at what Article 9 actually states, and there are phrases such as under its jurisdiction, as well as through its territory in accordance with international law. And we had a discussion on that. We had differing views on this. Especially certain states parties felt that we shouldn't try and reinterpret international law. Point taken, that's not what we're here to do. We are here to, at best, develop a voluntary guide on how to implement this particular article in the convention. Article 3, we looked at regulation of transit and transshipment of arms by land, and particularly in terms of transit and transshipment of arms by both road and rail in practice. Once again, looking at regulatory measures that we have, as well as the issue of free trade zones. We did something similar on transit and transshipment by air in the same session. That was in our February session. And we looked once again at national regulatory measures and which government departments or agencies or entities or structures were involved in that process. So the additional topics left for us to discuss is the one that we're going to tackle this afternoon, measures to regulate the transit and transshipment of arms by sea. which is perhaps the predominant method. Once again, which government departments and agencies are involved, and as well as what do the international and regional instruments say about this particular thing. Tomorrow morning, we'll tackle the issue of the role of the private sector, on which few of us are actually experts, because most of us come either from governments, international organizations, or non-governmental organizations. So we'll have a kickoff presentation on that issue as well, and then an interactive discussion following that. There's one thing that some of you have alluded to previously. It's the last topic in our work plan, and that is the relationship between Article 9 on transit and transshipment, and then Articles 6 and 7, which Ambassador Sanchez has just covered as well in his session. Article 11, diversion. Article 12, and record keeping. Now, considerations relating to the multi-year work plan, overarching considerations. Has sufficient time been allocated to each topic? Have any key concepts that should be unpacked be omitted? And then we would, I think, as the other facilitators have emphasized, we depend very heavily on your written inputs on this. I know that there are comments that have been made in Ambassador Sanchez's sessions about only 20 presentations or written inputs have been made, which is insufficient and so on. Well, actually, I envy him because he's received far more than I have. And without these written inputs, we can't prepare a voluntary guide, as simple as that. So I would urge you to reflect on all the topics in this, not only today's topic, but all the topics, and to give us something in writing. I would much appreciate that. I hand over the floor to Dr. Hernig, if the Secretariat could pull up her presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon also from my side. I have the pleasure to talk about transshipment and transit of arms by sea from a transport law perspective. I try to be not too technical. My agenda is, after a short introduction, I would like to give an overview about the arms transport by sea from the private law perspective, followed by transit restrictions in the context of transport by sea from regulatory side. As an overview, oh, okay, do you see this slide? No, it's a bit big. I'm really, really sorry. So as an overview, there are several topics to tackle. So we have the transport, including loading and discharging. From a private law perspective and from international perspective, we have the Hague-Wisby rules, which are frequently used in international transport. If the Hague-Wisby rules are not applicable, usually domestic law applies to it. It also applies in the context of charter parties, of course. From a regulatory perspective, it's the firearm protocol and the Wassenaar agreement. Regarding the storage safety, that is of course slightly touched upon by the Hague-Wisby rules, but we also have the International Convention of the Safety of Life at Sea, the so-called SOLAS Convention. Dangerous goods may be an issue, but I will come to this later. That's in the context of Article 9, it is not that big of an issue. There we have an International Maritime Dangerous Goods Code as an annex to the SOLAS Convention. For the transit itself, the Hague-Wisby rules apply to the entire journey of the transport, and We also have the UNCLOS Convention, so the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, which Professor Patrick already referred to earlier. For arrest as a particular delicate problem, I also mentioned at the slide, unfortunately you cannot see it, the Arrest Convention and regionally the EU Customs Code. Before I go into the transport and the transit itself, I would like to highlight the importance of transshipment in Article 9 because of what you see here, the Port of Rotterdam. The Port of Rotterdam is rather large. There are a lot of operations going on. There are a lot of hinterland networks that need to be considered by saying, okay, we regulate the entire transshipment. So it's not only about a vessel that's being cleared or about simple unloading operations. It's much more when we talk about transshipment. The ATT itself does not define the transshipment. I wanted to highlight that there is at least one international convention on the liability of the operator of transport terminals. The terminal operator is one that is performing transport or procuring transport-related services. This entails storage, warehousing, loading, unloading, stowage, trimming, dunnaging, and lashing. So here you see how many operations are involved in such a transshipment, especially in the context of the transport by sea. For the regulatory perspective, of course, the User's Guide to European Union Council Position 2008 from 1944 is relevant, and there it states the transshipment is the transit involving the physical operation of unloading goods from the importing means of transport followed by reloading general onto another exporting means of transport. So it is in general a gap, but please, I would urge that this gap should not be underestimated because it involves a lot of loading, it involves stowage plans and storage at the vessel, and it involves discharge. Of course, the port is a major storage area where goods, in particular arms, can get lost. It is the final destination for a vessel, not only arrested vessels, and it is relevant, the transshipment area in itself is relevant for permission to unload. So this is relevant in the context of prohibition and restrictions. When we have a look at the transport by sea, from a transport law perspective, as I said, the Hague-Wisby rules apply. The Hague-Wisby rules base on the Hague rules plus the Wisby Protocol from 1968. It was amended 1979 regarding the limits of liability of the carrier. There are also the Hamburg rules. These are in force, but they are not as frequently used as the Hague-Wisby rules. The Hague-Wisby rules only apply if the transport is covered by a bill of lading or a similar document of title. That gives private parties the opportunity to opt out by simply using a waybill, so a normal transport document, and then there is no international regime. So how do the Hague-Wisby rules work? Well, they apply in relation between the shipper and the carrier. And that is basically quite similar to what what I presented last time already. In the context of arms transport, it is important that the shipper is the one that needs to provide all necessary information, all necessary documents, and of course also all necessary licenses. The carrier on his side has the crucial duties like storage and loading. I would like to dive into this a bit. The legal basis can be found in Article 3 of the Hague-Wisby rules. According to Article 3 of the Hague-Wisby rules, the carrier is obliged to make the ship seaworthy, man and equip it sufficiently, and basically to have a cargo-worthy ship. What does this mean in arms transport context? Well, of course, the ship must be fit for the journey. That is quite clear. The crew must be trained sufficiently to handle these types of goods. And the vessel must be prepared for these types of goods. In particular, when we talk about arms transport, in the context of Article 2, this means that we have heavy vessels, that we have heavy goods, that we have bulky cargo that needs to be secured on board. And this means that the crew must be trained in a way that it can keep this cargo on board. Last but not least, the cargo worthiness also implies if we have particular sensitive goods that cannot be stored close to temperature sensitive goods or explosive goods, this must be considered as well for the storage. Then the carrier is under a contingent obligation to properly carefully load, handle, stow, carry, keep, and care for and discharge the goods. What does this mean in the context of arms transport? Here you see a storage plan of a vessel. If the vessel is loaded only on one side with heavy weapons, heavy arms, this means that the seaworthiness of the vessel is endangered. If there is a marine casualty as a consequence of this, this means that weapons can end up being in the sea, ultimately at a certain beach, and then of course this must be secured, that the weapons are not, or that arms in general are not being rescued illegally. For bulky cargo, especially tanks, it must be certain that these tanks are lashed appropriately. This sounds rather natural, but there is case law explicitly on tanks that were not lashed appropriately and ended up in sea. So then, if you are lucky, that may end up on the ground. If not, if it's lighter weapons, may end up being on beaches. For the loading process itself, there are international standards set by the SOLAS Convention that need to be complied with by the carrier himself. A next issue may be dangerous goods. There is an annex in the SOLAS Convention on dangerous goods, but it becomes only relevant in the context of ammunition, and Article 9 does not refer to ammunition. It only refers to the goods, to the arms mentioned in Article 2. There is another special issue, deviation. I know that Article 11 of the ATT deals with it. From a private law perspective, deviation is not a problem. The carrier can deviate from the prescribed route as long as the deviation is reasonable or for the rescue of life. And there is a certain conflict, but of course, the regulatory side prevails. As an add-on, there is also a rule in the SOLAS Convention regarding the prevention to the introduction of unauthorized weapons, incendiary devices, or explosive to ships or port facilities that may be considered in the present context as well. Coming to intermediate stops, that may be an issue as well, especially if the vessel, and if a vessel carries weapon, it's still a merchant vessel. If a vessel gets arrested under the Arrest Convention, then of course it must be considered that there is sufficient permission given to unload the goods, for instance. Regarding the transit restrictions, that can become relevant in two different scenarios. So first we have the scenario on sea, so during the voyage, and secondly, we have the scenario for discharge permission, so whether the goods can be unloaded, whether arms can be unloaded at port of destination. Regarding the first one, I want to keep it rather short because Professor Patrick already elaborated on the concept of innocent passage under the UNCLOS Convention. Generally, an innocent passage is a passage or is a voyage that is not aggressive, so it's only the passage that is relevant. It's not the nature of the goods that are loaded. But if there is, for instance, a UN Security Council arms embargo, this may or must enjoy preferences and prevail over the innocent passage, also in accordance with Article 6 of the ATT. Last but not least, we also have an issue at the port of destination. So now you may say, well, if the goods are not permitted to be released, the customs authority can simply say, okay, we keep it at the vessel and then that's it. But if an embargo or a prohibition is imposed on goods along the journey, the storage plans were not adjusted. This means that there is cargo that may be stored underneath the cargo that is prohibited for unloading. And this means that, of course, it must be unloaded in order to free the cargo that is stored underneath. And for this situation, there must be rules. Under the EU Customs Code, the customs authorities are allowed to confiscate the cargo, so to ensure that they are not lost in a way. But this is a delicate situation that must be considered as well. Thank you for your attention. That is it. I'm looking forward to your questions and thank you for the chance again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hönig. I would like to open the floor for questions, first of all, actually, to Dr. Hönig. But also general comments on this particular topic, transit and transshipment by sea. I see a hand, but I don't see a flag. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm Mr. Barouti Likoy from Recherche et Documentation Juridique Africaine, and I want to intervene here on my individual capacity as a lawyer involved specialized in shipping and maritime business. I don't have a question, but some clarification on the presentation. The first one is about trained crew for the shipping sector. Normally, big shipping company used to select crew who is cheapest possible in the market. And if we take this view, it's very difficult to have a training crew who can easily detect or follow the standard of control of arms in the shipping business. So this is the first information or clarification I wanted to give. The second is that it is very difficult to find a ship, especially that we call liner, from point A to point B only with arms as goods. It's always that we call feeder. The ship will stop by almost every port to discharge the good, and the arm can be discharged in the port C of D or at the end of the travel. That's the second clarification. The third one is the nature of the port. Now we have three sorts of ports. We have public ports, we have private ports, we have that we call community ports of mixed. And all that kind of ports works according to 3 shifts, night, afternoon, and morning. So the best solution here is to ask that all ship or boats carrying the arm should only reach the public port for the control. It's very difficult to do control through the crew because every shipper they put the crew the cheapest possible, and most of them from Philippines or Malaysia and the other developing country, or it's difficult to control where the ship will reach the port. If it's a private port, the ship can reach on Sunday. And that there is no official officer to make control. The ship reach Sunday and remain until Monday when the office will be open. But in the meantime, they can do the diversion of arms. So the best solution is to ask that all ship carry, all masters who know that the ship carry the arm should reach only the official port and during the official hour of work. That is the clarification I wanted to give on my individual capacity as an academic involved in shipping and maritime business. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is why it's very important to have strong national regulations, legislation and regulations on this, because if the ship is carrying arms, how can it dock in the first place? That's my question. But I don't need an answer to that right now. Before I pass the floor to Dr. Hernig to possibly respond, is there anyone else, any other delegation that wishes to take the floor on the presentation or on the topic as a whole? Okay, while you think about that, Dr. Hernig, would you like to respond?
Thank you very much for the clarification. Yes, of course, that is definitely a problem. From a legal perspective and based on the Hague-Wisby rules, there is a clear duty of the carrier to train the crew, but I know that the reality is different. But maybe this is also an issue that should be addressed by the Maritime Labour Convention and the International Maritime Organization and the rules implemented there.
Thank you. Anyone else wishes to take the floor? Or are we going to have an early afternoon? France, you have the floor.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Thank you to Mr. Facilitator, and thank you to you, Julia Hernig, Dr. Hernig, for your very comprehensive presentation. I am going to share with you some ideas to try and generate an exchange among ourselves and to feed on what has been said and talk to you about the French experience as regards to transit and transshipment. As was said, the control of activities in the area of transit or transshipment by sea is a very complex matter. The regulation of these activities has to take into consideration the existing international instruments and the pertinent provisions of the UN Convention on the Right of the Sea, or the Law of the Sea, which is something that was recalled earlier. It is also important that states take into consideration when choosing the national procedures, their needs and priorities. France exercises control on transit and transshipment operations but does not submit all of these operations to prior authorizations. This is required for road transport from border to border. Transit transshipment operations in French ports are also subject to the prior delivery of an authorization relating to weapons. The custom authorities issue these authorizations, and custom authorities also carry out the control of incoming and outgoing physical flows. Customs officials look at the documents that are available and can also check the merchandise that is being carried. As regards the role of private actors in the area of transit and transshipment, it is an essential role. And private players are playing a very important role in the implementation of the control and regulation measures that apply. And this relates to strengthened control on the persons involved in arms transfers and associated operations. In France, for instance, a prior authorization is necessary to exercise intermediation activities and manufacturing activities, which we call ASCP, delivered by the Ministry of Armies. This is an indispensable prerequisite insofar as France, all of the sector of defense and the flows is subject to a prohibition regime. Furthermore, transit authorizations can be only given by the proper officials. And there needs to be good cooperation with the operators, the maritime operators, to make them aware of the procedures that apply as regards the control of arms transfers, and to encourage them to develop conformity measures. In France, many activities in the area of awareness raising are carried out with the private sector through the organization of a dedicated conference that is organized each year by the Ministry of Armies in France. Private players also play a very important role as regards to the prevention of illicit trafficking, especially in the phase of transit and transshipment, and do cooperate with national authorities to intercept illicit flows. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you to the distinguished representative of France. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina.
Thank you very much, facilitator. We'd like to thank you for your efforts in establishing a list of standards and best practices for transit and transshipment. We think this will serve our national practices, and it will also favor the fulfillment of the obligations derived from ATT. In Mercosur, Decision number 2 of 1994 adopted an agreement named Transport for Dangerous Goods in Mercosur. And it also applies for transport, air transport, land transport, and maritime transport. This agreement serves to identify dangerous goods, to identify dangerous transport, and the training requirements of the drivers. We also have specific dispositions in applicable for transport of these dangerous goods. And if you are interested, we can always provide you with further information. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Quisiera tomar la palabra por la Agencia Nacional de Materiales Controlados de la República Argentina.
I don't know who that was. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor facilitador.
Thank you very much, facilitator. As this is the first time I take the floor, I'd like to thank you for the work you are carrying out. With respect to Article 9. For Peru, this article is very pertinent and relevant. Transit and transshipment are key in controlling conventional weapons and avoiding their diversion. If communication does not work between the exporter and importer, there are few other things we can do to control the transfer of weapons. We also believe that training the members of the crew is fundamental. Information needs to be shared between all three interested parties. And transport needs to be regulated as well as transit and transshipment. These are for us the main concepts relating to Article 9. Thank you.
Thank you, Peru. Do I see any more delegations that wish to intervene at this point? We have none online, I would assume. That is not the case at the moment. I would like to invite Dr. Hernig to respond to some of the comments made thus far. Dr. Hernig.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I can just repeat regarding the training. Yes, of course, this is very, very relevant. The problem is usually it's not sufficient to share the information just between three parties. If we look at the overall system, how it works at vessels, then we usually have multiple parties involved at one vessel providing different levels of seafarer, and this makes it rather complicated because we have a lot of subcontracts involved and their information may get lost. Regarding the cooperation with the maritime operators, this is really, really relevant, especially in the port field. But it's not only the maritime operators, also the hinterland operators that are really, have a crucial role in the entire transshipment operations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hernig. Well, we don't see anyone else wishing to take the floor. I would therefore move to conclude this meeting. I'd like to thank Dr. Hernig for coming to give us a presentation, a very insightful presentation, an overview that would not have confused many of us because it was fairly straightforward this time. Her previous presentation on transit transshipment by land lost me a little bit, but that's due to my own shortcomings and not nothing else. If you think of something overnight or this evening that you still wish to raise on this particular issue, transit or transshipment by sea, or any of the other previous topics, please do not hesitate to do so tomorrow morning. Our session, as I said, tomorrow morning will cover the private sector, and it is likely that there will be time for you to intervene at that particular stage. So before I adjourn, I would like to ask the Secretariat, Dumisani, if he has any announcement to make. Dumisani?
Thank you, Rob. I've got just two announcements to make. The first one is after the closure of this session, as already communicated to delegates, we have a side event that is taking place. It is organized by the German presidency. It's on their priority theme of post-shipment controls. It will be held virtually. It will not be an in-person workshop. It's a virtual workshop, and all delegates will be invited to participate in this. The information about this workshop is already on the website under the relevant page, the site events, and including the link. If you need the link, and you can go to the ATT website and you'll find the link of this workshop there. So the presidency is encouraging all delegates to attend or to participate in this workshop. It's very important because it concerns the post-shipment controls, which is a priority theme of the German presidency for the year. The second one is about uploading of statements. Delegates who would like to have their statements uploaded on the ATT website are free to do so, and they can just transmit those statements to the Secretariat, and would post them on the website accordingly. And the last one is about video recordings. It has become tradition that we have the recordings, video recordings of these proceedings. And the videos then of the proceedings of today would start to be available tomorrow, and in that particular order until the end of the week. But you would be able to listen to proceedings of today at your own time using the videos that will be posted on the website. Thank you so much, Mr. Facilitator. Hand back over to you.
My thanks to the Secretariat. If there is no delegation wishing to take the floor, I wish you a good afternoon and evening, and we'll see each other here tomorrow. This meeting is adjourned. No, it's not adjourned. I see a flag. Kenya, Zambia, sorry.
I just wanted to find a clarification. Is it morning or afternoon tomorrow?
It's in your welcome pack, and it's on the ATT website, and it's everywhere. It's at 1 o'clock. Luckily in the afternoon.
Thank you, because
and not 1 a.m.
I heard you say morning tomorrow. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.